For those of you that may not know me, my name is Greg Whitcup, and I am the director of the Center for Collections and Research, which is presenting this series of lectures by my colleague, Kevin Adkisson. As I didn't have the opportunity to join you the first two nights, I thought that I might just give you a very brief preview of a couple of things that you might look forward to at the center in the upcoming months, because before you know it, this series is going to be over and you are going to be wondering what you are going to do with your time. So, even before this series ends, we would like to invite all of you back to Cranbrook on Saturday, a week from Saturday, February 29th. We are working with the metalsmithing department at Cranbrook Academy of Art, and they are going to be staging a series of interventions in the Booth Manor home, Cranbrook House. Eero Saarinen, the head of the metalsmithing department, is very interested in presenting metalwork in environments that is different than a white box. That opening is going to go from 5 o'clock until 8 o'clock, again Saturday, February 29th, and Iris and some of the artists will be talking at 6 o'clock. There is no charge for that event, but we would ask you to register in advance if you are interested in joining us. Looking ahead to Sunday, March 15th, we have another one of our ever-popular edible landscape dinners. 2 weeks ago, Kevin talked about Cranbrook School for Boys, and you no doubt saw images of the magnificent dining hall. So imagine that space with one long table running down the middle, white tablecloths, flowers, and enjoying a 5-course dinner created by Chef Kate Williams of Lady of the House in Corktown, Detroit. A pretty spectacular evening. Last count, I have room for 12 more people. So if you're interested, go to our website as soon as you can, or see me afterwards. Looking ahead to April, we are going to be having our 4th annual Bowder Lecture, sponsored by President Emeritus Dr. Lillian Bowder. This lecture is going to bring in the Senior Curator of Design from the V&A, the Victoria and Albert in London. His name is Brendan Cormier, and he is the co-curator of their blockbuster exhibition right now called Cars Accelerating the Modern World. But more than just an auto show, this is an exhibition that really steps back, takes a look at the changes, both positive and negative, that the automobile has brought on our culture and society from the perspective of a group of curators living on the other side of the pond. That also is free, but it's going to be limited seating, so we'd also suggest that you register for that as soon as you can. You'll be seeing an e-blast on that on Wednesday, so you can't jump on that quite yet. And then finally, we have been celebrating the work that we are doing to preserve and rehabilitate the Japanese garden at Cranbrook through a series of 4 workshops that have been looking at some of the traditional arts associated with Japan. The very first one, dealing with wagashi, Japanese sweets, is sold out, as is the last one, the tea ceremony, but there are still seats available for the one that is going to look at ikebana, of course, the art of flower arrangement, as well as shodo, the art of Japanese calligraphy. These are going to be taking place in April, but again, there's not many seats left for them. Like this lecture series tonight, just about everything we do seems to strike a chord out there in the world, and when you get that e-blast, react as soon as you can. So without further ado, let's focus on stripped classicism tonight.
Thank you, Greg. And thanks, everyone, for coming out. And I appreciate the delay of a week while my family and I celebrated the life of my grandmother, Merle, who passed away at the age of 95. So she loved beautiful things, and there's nothing more beautiful, in my opinion, than Cranbrook. So I am delighted to be here tonight talking about probably our most iconic building, the sort of postcard element of Cranbrook, the building that is sort of directly above and behind you, the Cranbrook Academy of Art Museum and Library Complex from 1942. And I titled this week Stripped Classicism and American Modernism because stripped classicism is my preferred way to describe the style of this building. But American modernism is the sort of genre in which it fits. And unlike, say, international modern or German modern, there really isn't one American modernism. Frank Lloyd Wright is a variant. Stripped classicism is a variant. They will all sort of be kiboshed by mid-century modernism and the sort of tyranny of what we discuss next week at mid-century. But in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, there was an enormous amount of diversity in architecture. And so I'm going to be showing a number of different movements tonight, from the Art Deco to international modernism. And I want you to think of all of them as being modern. And if you had seen them when they were new, you would have said, this is a modern building. So there's what my old boss, Robert A.M. Stern, used to call parallel moderns. There are all these different ways of being modern. Last week, when I focused on the schools, the architecture of Eero Saarinen was really divided into two camps: the School for Boys, the red brick, and Kingswood School for Girls, the golden brick. And at the School for Boys, Eero he is this masterful arranger of different historical forms. It's eclectic without being didactic. There's never a sort of lack of associative references, but in this skillful combination of all these different pieces, he creates something very new. And it's a sort of emphasis on material, this sort of sublime use of brick and of stone and of tile and of metal. And it's the combination of all these things that, though they come out of traditional architecture, they make something that's really unique. And so you wander through the courtyard, and it's this architecture of unfolding spaces and of buildings of different heights that you have to experience as you flow one sort of space to the next. And it always seems familiar, but it's really not like anything else. And then the interiors, which really harken back to George Booth and his love of the arts and crafts, Saarinen's own history of the arts and crafts, English education, all again these associations. And around the time that Eero built these buildings, he had this to say about his theory of architecture. Our traditions are founded on two great spheres of ideas: classical antiquity, which brings clarity and humanity, and Gothicism, a depth and intensity of feeling. Classical antiquity created universal human values, the republican nature of Athens, and Gothicism is consummate in organic and constructive unity. The Gothic is the mystery, and that's what he's sort of combining at the boys' school: classicism and Gothicism. Yet at Kingswood School for Girls, underneath this monolithic copper roof that turns this lovely shade of green, and all of these terraces sort of splaying out into the landscape, and it's nestled there in between the hill and the lake, we see a very different architecture. We see these organic columns that recall things like natural growth and wheat. You see the load-bearing walls of brick supporting these massive roofs. And then the architectural detail is much less variety, but it's iterative. So it's a certain form, the telescoping form, the something smaller into the next largest thing. So less variety than the boys' school, but this sort of cohesive vision that comes directly from Frank Lloyd Wright. And then the interior space is much more bright and open. And later, at the end of his career, Saarinen codifies this, his newest theory of architecture, as that the plant grows from the seed, the characteristics of its form lie concealed in the potential power of the seed. The soil gives it strength to grow, and the outer influences decide its shape in the environment. So gone is the language of sort of Gothicism and Classicism, what you might root in architecture, this sort of Western architectural language. And in comes the sort of transcendental language that he's clearly getting from Frank Lloyd Wright and Louis Sullivan. So he's more Americanized his theory into this idea that architecture is organic and grows up. And I think tonight, as we talk about the Academy of Art, we're going to see buildings that bridge this transition, that bridge from the sort of neo-Gothic arts and crafts through the organic into this something modern. But I would challenge anyone to classify any part of the Art Academy's campus into a single style. I think here Saarinen is at his most sort of adventurous, but also at his most stringent budgets. The Academy never has any money. And so the architecture reflects that. We're also going to see, and because I'm not going to talk much about the boys and girls school later, but I think that's the architecture of Kingswood and the boys school are very fully formed. They're architecture for young people. It's a teaching architecture. It's full of art that Booth purchases to teach. And so it is the sort of formation of young minds versus the Art Academy is really a framework. The Art Academy is open. There's not as much art placed into the buildings. The interiors are much more Spartan because these are advanced students. These are minds that are making new art and making new adventures. And so the architecture becomes much more of a frame and less of a teaching tool. So just to review our first 2 weeks, Cranbrook House sits here on the property by Albert Kahn. The School for Boys is down here on Lone Pine Road. Kingswood School for Girls is behind the lake on Cranbrook Road. And tonight we'll talk about the Institute of Science very briefly, which is at the center of campus, much to Saarinen's chagrin. He did not want any buildings in the middle. He wanted woods, nature in the middle. And then the Art Academy will be our real focus, which is directly abutting the boys' school centered on Academy Way. Now, George Booth had multiple starts at forming an art colony. You remember that he was part of the Boston Society of Arts and Crafts. He was a founder of the Detroit Society. He served as its first president. As its mission changed, he helped establish its own School of Arts and Crafts. He became disenchanted with the Detroit School of Arts and Crafts, or the School of the Detroit Society, and he was actually approached by the University of Michigan in 1922 to help form an independent architectural program within the College of Engineering. So at the time, the architecture students were in the engineering school, and Emma Lorch, the dean, came to Booth and said, "Won't you help me argue in Lansing to make this an independent entity?" George Booth declined to finance this new structure or to participate, but of course his son was enrolled at the school at the time, and you'll remember the pageant celebrating Eero Saarinen's arrival, and Eero taught here for 2 years, from 22 to 24. And while Eero was teaching Henry Booth comes up with this drawing that is in Cranbrook archives, plan for an Academy of Art. And it's for a non-disclosed location as he designs it. But of course, Eero comes to realize that Henry Booth is not designing some hypothetical project. He is designing for his father this vision of an art academy. And where is that vision coming from? Most directly, George Booth is writing by 1919 about founding an art school, but in 1922, he visits the American Academy in Rome, and this serves as the model for Cranbrook Academy of Art. George and Ellen admired the buildings. They visited with the fellows. They admired the sort of way that it taught. It didn't have classes. It didn't have lectures. It didn't have coursework. In fact, when they opened the American Academy in 1914, there was only one book, and they would do group readings out of the one book. And George and Ellen admired this sort of loose idea, which is if you surround yourself in Rome, the eternal city, by osmosis, you will learn architecture. And the American Academy was for advanced students. You got there by doing advanced design work, drawing or building, and you got a 3-year all-expense-paid fellowship there. Now, in 1923, Henry Booth would visit. George and Henry see the need for a car, and they give a car to the American Academy in Rome so that the students can get around. And at the same time, George Booth donates the George Booth Traveling Fellowship to the University of Michigan, which is still an active traveling fellowship. At the time, it was almost $20,000 equivalent. So George Booth is clearly invested in architecture education in Michigan. And then he gets a copy of this book, Art and Industry, which evaluated 55 schools of art, and it pretty much noted that the arts and crafts movement in America had had little influence on raising the general aesthetic taste of Americans, and that American schools were lagging far behind the German schools. And it singles out two schools in particular. One is the South Kensington School. You'll remember the South Kensington Museum, what's now the Victoria and Albert, started from the 1851 World's Fair, the Crystal Palace, and then it turned into the Museum of Bad Taste. In 1857, they opened a school proper, and it came to be known as the South Kensington Principle, that if you surround yourself with great craft of the age, you, a craftsman, will learn great craft. And you'll see a lot of schools and museums founded on this principle, including the Grand Ducal Saxon Art School in Weimar, which was founded to create this sort of union of craftsmen. It was headed by Henry van de Velde, the great Belgian Art Nouveau architect from 1901. But in 1919, he leaves because of World War I, and in 1919 they lose the name and they're christened the Bauhaus. And Walter Gropius becomes the director of the school, renames it, and then years later moves it to Dessau into buildings of his own design. And the Dessau Bauhaus by Walter Gropius is really an Albert Kahn factory. It is a concrete frame building with glass walls hanging down the side. We're looking at the studio building, so it's all northern light flooding the studios. And inside, the students did a very sort of rigid exploration of color, of form, of shape, of material. Here you see projects from students of Joseph Albers. And then it was this communal life of the masters and the fellows. Interestingly, there was no architecture program. That would start after Gropius had actually left. But it's the arts and crafts for a modern age. And in the sort of Bauhaus manifesto, I think we can see strings of Cranbrook Academy. Together let us desire, conceive, and create the new structure of the future, which will embrace architecture and sculpture and painting in one unity. This is where we break from George Booth. And which will one day rise towards heaven from the hands of a million workers like the crystal symbol of a new faith. And that's the sort of fundamental difference of the Bauhaus school and German modernism. It is a socialist movement with social aims. It is a workers' movement. That is what modern architecture is to the Germans. But we take these two examples, the American Academy in Rome, the Bauhaus in Germany, and we get this sort of uniquely American enterprise, which is Cranbrook Academy of Art. This is the very first plan. It's a tour de force. I think it actually frightens George Booth. It's Bob Swanson who comes to the rescue and convinces Saarinen that he has to scale back this plan and convinces George Booth to keep Saarinen on as a consultant. Because what Saarinen is proposing, essentially what is now the Academy would fit all right here. And so Saarinen is proposing this grand series of horticulture schools and theater schools, music schools, really all of the arts together. He comes back with a smaller plan. At this point, you see the School for Boys has begun work, and so it is already outlined in gray. And here Saarinen proposes a sort of scaled-down version of Versailles. It is this whole sort of city of art. And then in his last plan that he does at Michigan, all of these are done at the University of Michigan for George Booth, we see a row of faculty housing. We see a tower at the center. In front are museum galleries. On the side are studios back here. Across the back is a dining hall and kitchen. And then this is actually a mosaic hall, which is a very sort of Scandinavian thing to include. And what this would have looked like is very different. So for those of you who really know Cranbrook, this is the view if you were standing at Lake Jonah looking back to Lone Pine Road. And it's this series of courtyards and all centered on this almost cathedral-like tower that is the museum. And then here's the dining hall hanging off the back. And to better convince George Booth of the merits of this project, the Saarinens build this model with Loja Saarinen serving as the model maker in plasticine. And you see these rows of colonnaded courtyards. You see this heavy masonry architecture, very Gothic, very traditional. The model would go through a number of revisions. Here it is in the Cranbrook Architectural Office. You'll notice what Saarinen has surrounded himself with. The Chicago Tribune Tower that brought him to America framed on the wall. His plan of Chicago, another great city plan. This is Burton Tower at University of Michigan. And then at the center of the room stands this vision of an Academy of Art. And it's laid out on this L shape. And where is this L shape coming from? But Saarinen and Booth's favorite city, the great urban republic, Venice. And so it is again the Piazza San Marco with the rows of columns around, the tower at the center, and these trapezoidal, irregular shaped plazas. Now, Saarinen had actually already designed an art school in 1910. He designed an art building, which was going to have studios. This was for a World's Fair in Helsinki that did not happen. And you see here the main axis coming to a pool, and then the main cross axis anchored by a tower. And so you have this, again, repeated basic form that comes back over and over in Saarinen's career. Though this World Fair did not happen, the World's Fair that did, that would change Saarinen's taste and the taste of the world, was the Paris World's Fair of 25, which is where we get the term Art Deco. And so the Art Deco World's Fair in Paris launches a new mode of decorative design and architecture, and the Americans were not invited to participate. And so America had to have its own rebuttal. And so 4 years later, we have The Architect in the Industrial Arts, which was an exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. And it was a show where you went and you looked in room after room of good design. And who designed the dining room but Mr. Eero Saarinen? And so here you have an example of he's been in America for 5 years at this point, a little over 5 years. You have Pewabic pottery tile fireplace. You have wallpaper designed by his daughter Pipsan, a hand weaving woven at Cranbrook and designed by Loja. You have this heavy wooden furniture, and on the center of the table you have glassware and china, all designed by Saarinen. So he has designed this total environment. And it was architects, not industrial designers at the show, because of their strong position in regard to manufacturing and into regard to style. So when the Met was looking to who are making influential decisions about designs, it was the architects, and it was Saarinen. Of course, this is not really mass producible. It's highly luxurious. The Art Deco will flourish in America, but only briefly in Saarinen's career in buildings like his Hudnut Salon on Fifth Avenue. Just as I could use any number of examples of American Art Deco, but just to sort of place this in its context, my favorite Art Deco building, the Bullock's department store in Los Angeles, which of course is anchored by this tower that is mighty reminiscent of Saarinen's Tribune Tower, again seeing Saarinen's influence on American architecture. In these early days at Cranbrook, as he's designing Cranbrook, he does get other commissions. So this is the Christian Science Church in Minneapolis, which has this stepped octagonal drum in which the church service would be held. It's sort of antiquity, it's early Christian architecture. Think of the Hagia Sophia. This is not a Gothic cathedral. It's certainly not a New England church. It would be sort of totally wonderful and totally unique in American architecture. And I think what's important about this project for our purposes is that, again, here, Saarinen is not using a single historical source. It is, again, this inclusive attitude of the past with classical columns, early Christian form, blended into something unique. A year later, he designs the League of Nations, which is this, again, a sort of volume of space, an assembly hall anchored by this octagonal tower, and this very sort of organic, almost plastic feeling. The whole building is growing like a mountain. And he was doing these out of his Cranbrook studio. Here's a photograph of the architectural office. And on display is the Alexander Hamilton Memorial Project. Here's a model of it. You see those Kingswood-esque fluted columns. And at the center of this memorial, which would have been on Chicago's lake shore, is this wonderful sort of opening. Again, what is this referencing? What is the historical form? Something truly unique and new. And over the course of the project, we begin to see those Kingswood elements, the sort of flowing forms that fit within each other, streamlined into these stripped columns where there's no column capital, there's no column base. It is just line work. It's just column. It's the essence of a column. And let's compare this to a memorial that did miraculously get built, the Jefferson Memorial, probably the single most controversial thing ever built in Washington, D.C. And it was finished in 1943. And Saarinen's design is abandoned in 1937. And what the Jefferson Memorial represents is sort of American classicism, American tradition, the architecture of Greek and Rome, taken here to America. But I think actually Saarinen's work is really relying on similar principles: symmetry, axial relationships, a certain grandiosity to it that was very typical of the time, and that can all be dated back to the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. Called the White City, this is what kickstarts America's obsession with neoclassicism. This is why your courthouses look the way they do and your public libraries look the way they do. And this was designed by Daniel Burnham and a number of different architects, all of whom had either studied at or were influenced by the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the Paris School of Architecture, which was all about tradition. It was all about a curriculum based in the classical arts, classical architecture, ancient Greek and Roman culture. Students had to prove their skills by drawing. It was timed. It was these elaborate, grand schemes of redesigning huge swaths of cities. And it catches on, and we have the City Beautiful movement in America. Again, just a sort of textbook example of the public potential of the Beaux-Arts style, this grand classical planning where you have this hierarchy of space and of form, the New York Public Library, covered in sort of symmetry and statuary and pilasters and garlands. In Detroit, our own great Beaux-Arts complex is the library facing off with the Detroit Institute of Art. And Paul-Philippe Cray had studied and taught at the École des Beaux-Arts. So there's something actually quite Beaux-Arts about Cranbrook, these major axes, these major lines, these direct symmetries, but Saarinen shifts it all. He's a little bit wobbly, he's more gentle, he can't escape that Gothic influence that says this will be more pleasant if it's not this sort of rigid planning. And the first building that gets built is actually already on this plan. It was designed not by Saarinen, but by Henry Booth and Bob Swanson, who were Saarinen's co-architects at the beginning of the School for Boys project, where his students at Michigan became his son-in-law. And Bob Swanson and Booth designed this building, which is essentially an English arts and crafts load-bearing masonry structure. I think its best feature is the crane that is made out of bricks, tiles, and those are actually broken water pipes laid in to be the water. And then across the street from this, Saarinen gets to build his first building for the Academy of Art, the Arts and Crafts Courtyard. And you'll see it starts just a three-sided courtyard. It is, again, a load-bearing masonry structure. As these buildings are wrapping up, the construction is beginning on housing. How are you going to have craftspeople come and fill up these studios if you don't have a place for them to live? And so here you see the Arts Club, what we call Dorm 1, going up. At the same time, in the foreground, you see an addition to the first administration building. So once things get off the ground, they move quite quickly. Here you see Academy Way, which many of you came in on, and the famous bumps are here. They probably left over from the construction traffic. And you have this wonderful scaffolding construction where the concrete is being hoisted up and then sluiced down to make floors on either side of the street. And here you see Saarinen's addition. He's extended the language of the arts and crafts, but he's a bit more streamlined. He's lost the arched windows, and then he has these walls of windows of glass and zinc paneling. And then you have Academy Way at about 1931. The Arts Club, the dormitory is here, and then if we walk down this pathway, we'll be in the Arts and Crafts Studios. And what was going on here from 1928 to 1933? Last week when we looked at the dining hall, I said that I would come back to the clock at the end of the dining hall by Oscar Bach. This was commissioned by George Booth with great influence of his taste. And it's all the allied arts. So at noon you have the weaver, and at 3 o'clock you have the sculptor, and at 3 o'clock is the glass blower, 4 o'clock is the bookbinder, and right in the center is the blacksmith forge. So working on their anvil, George Booth, blacksmith, Cranbrook, blacksmith first. It is this really sort of powerful figure. The sparks are flying from the hammers, and that is what was happening in the arts and crafts courtyard. So here you see our first blacksmith, John Burnett, who is striking the anvil. Sparks are flying off just as they were next door on the clock. And in the floor, you see these andirons designed by Saarinen, made in the forge. And Saarinen designed countless andirons, and these sketches are in the collection of the Art Museum now. The other studios included the Silver Shop, led by Arthur Neville Kirk, who was hired out of the Detroit Society of Arts and Crafts and who made fine works of silver designed by Saarinen. This is a little cigarette case where you pull up the puffs of smoke to get your cigarette out of the box. And then you had the bookbinder, John Eschman. Remember George Booth's The Cranbrook Press. He is outfitting this quadrangle with what he loves. And so you have a series of guest books of the Odyssey, all these different texts that got custom bindings made here at Cranbrook. There was a cabinet shop. Here we see the Swedish cabinet worker Tor Berglund doing a French polish on the doors of this cabinet, which are his sort of proof piece of the skill of the craftsman, using all these tropical hardwoods and very delicate inlays with this massively heavy piece of furniture. And then there was the weaving studio, led by Eero Saarinen, and supervised in much of the design work done by Maja Andersson Virta, who was from the Swedish School of Handicraft and was a real tour de force of hand weaving. And this is one side of Loya's studio. She's sitting at the loom looking like she is an expert weaver. She is the amateur in this arrangement, and she has hired all of her Swedish weavers who are actually making the rugs. The other side of her studio is the showroom, where furniture designed by Eeliel, rugs designed by various designers, curtains designed by Loya. This is where you would come to order your fine rugs. And then if we look at the ceiling of the studio, you can just make out that there's fresco painted there by Catherine McEwen from the Detroit Society of Arts and Crafts. And on the left, you have the picking of cotton, and on the right, you have the harvesting of flax for linen. So you have weaving going on underneath these allegories of weaving. And then in the basement is where the full-size looms are, these 12-foot looms, 5 girls sitting here weaving, knotting all day until they produce these massive rugs for Cranbrook, like the one for the Rose Lobby. And they would take this 11.5 by 24-foot rug out into the grounds of Cranbrook and photograph them from the back of the Arts and Crafts studios onto the landscape. And so here's a picture about 1931. We have the Arts and Crafts courtyard where all of these studios are working, and these are commercial ventures. This is not the art school. These are not people who are attracting students. These are people selling craft. So this is the Arts and Crafts studio, the Arts Club where they live, and then you have the next series of buildings that I want to talk about. Saarinen's house and Millis's house, also known as Residence 1 and 2. You'll see that they open onto courtyards on the back. On the street, they continue the line of the street wall. They're the same height. All of Saarinen's buildings for the Academy are the same height, the same setback from the street. They all had the same garden wall. He is designing this as a little urban street, very modest from the outside, and then you go inside, and it is this sort of total Art Deco interior. You'll notice the fireplace is reused from the exhibit at the Met, and then everything handmade here at Cranbrook. Then the dining room is the sort of Art Deco full stop with the gold leaf ceiling, the fine furniture, these red, Chinese red niches situated on this octagonal carpet, and the table actually would expand so you could get up to 14 people to sit, at which point you needed to use your donut-shaped tablecloth so that you could still see the fine inlay of the table, and all of this is handmade, hand-embroidered, hand-laced here at Cranbrook. Upstairs in the bedroom, you have this sort of art moderne style. You can think of the Hollywood Hills almost as you look at these images. And then the bathroom, which takes us back to Vienna and the Wiener Werkstatt. Downstairs in Cozy Corner, it's very similar to their house at Vitras, these rugs that are coming off of the furniture and onto the floor. And then the north-south wing of the house is just one story, and it's the studio, where during formal occasions they could have it set up for tea or for graduation, but on a day-to-day basis, Saarinen was using this as one of his multiple studios at Cranbrook. Seen here about 1940 with the cartoon of a tapestry that Loya produced. And so here is Loya with her practical pumps sort of directing Eliel in some aspect of this tapestry. And if they seem very short, they were very short. And then in the back of the house, we see the house is just an L shape, but dividing us from Millis House is this covered porch. And notice these rectangular columns, very attenuated, 5 openings, remind you of the art museum, perhaps. And then again, the brickwork is really celebrated. So you have the band of bricks that's marking the windows, and it's a little hard to make out, but see how he runs headers, so short bricks in between. So you have the line of the windows, and then you have the line of the brick across the entire back. And then the paving is that same octagonal pattern that we saw in the dining room carpet. So from the dining room, you look out onto this octagon. And then other aspects of the house repeat. So you have the window in Cozy Corner that reappears in the brickwork of the art club. You have moments where the bricks are pushed in, or see here where he's running 2 shorter bricks in the course of 1 larger brick. Or here where you have a limestone dog sort of placed into the building. And then the endless variety of gables, and how many ways can you lay a gable? This real sort of celebration of craft, of the building of these buildings, and then a concrete gable for good measure. But the most fabulous work of brick is this little portal in the arts and crafts courtyard where you have this forced perspective because the opening is actually narrowing towards sun glitter, the sculpture. And so you see how the craftsman had to lay the bricks in this basket-woven pattern in order to get this forced perspective effect. And then at the center of it all sits sun glitter. This is a sculpture from about 1917, and it was by the Swedish sculptor Carl Millis. And this was one of Millis's favorite sculptures. He had a copy of it on the center of his dining room table. It's the first one to be installed at Cranbrook. And when we see sun glitter from down below, she's paired with this modern casting of a Roman reproduction of a Greek centaur. Purchased by George Booth for this ledge in 27. And this Millis and Greek and Rome go together like a glove. So this is Millis's house back in Stockholm, which he begins in 1906. You see this rugged landscape right in the sort of center of Stockholm Harbor. And he's filled it with Roman column capitals and then his own sculptures. And at Cranbrook, he comes and he is our head sculptor. He arrives in 1931, and at some point quickly thereafter, he ships over his collection. He called it the Barberini collection. It had pieces of the Barberini collection. And he fills his home with these Greek and Roman antiquities, and he called it his library. And so this is the same space that Saarinen's living room with the Pewabic pottery fireplace and the rug. This is the sort of mirror image of that house entirely different in this sort of Pompeian style, lots of reds and golds, and then just absolutely filled to the brim with ancient sculpture. And then his dining room, which has Swedish neoclassical furniture, gone is the Art Deco, except for this aluminum-leafed ceiling. And Millis would take people through tours of his library, and he would talk for 45 minutes or for 4 hours, and then he would conclude his tour with his little flashlight, and he would say, "Isn't it wonderful?" And then he made his own sculptures in the back of his house. Here's Frank Lloyd Wright hanging out with Carl Millis and Booth. Frank Lloyd Wright was wildly jealous of Millis's collection of Greek and Roman sculpture, and he called Millis the power behind the throne at Cranbrook. I don't really know what that means. And he also wrote in his autobiography that Millis's sculptures would come to Taliesin, Frank Lloyd Wright's own home. They did not. They were bought by the Swedish people. So in the back of Millis's house, he had his own studio where he was working, but he needed more space. And so shortly after his arrival, about 1933 or 4, this 30-foot by 80-foot studio was added on to the complex. And so we have the Arts and Crafts Courtyard, the Arts Club, Saarinen House, Millis House, and then Millis's addition of a studio here. And then as time moves on, by 1936, we have the addition of student sculpture studios. Millis hated to teach. He did not teach. He simply existed here. And so the students needed to be nearby the master if they were going to learn anything. And then here, a dormitory for women. And then shortly thereafter, this is about 1940, and all of these buildings are built about 1938, 39. More faculty housing, garage, and then student dormitories above, additional painting studios here. And so you see the extension of a series of quadrangles, but notice the roofs are getting flatter, the buildings are getting flatter. We're getting a slightly more modern aesthetic. And at this point, Saarinen helps define what Cranbrook Academy of Art would be. He says, it is not an art school in the ordinary meaning. It is a working place for creative art. The leading idea is to have artists live at Cranbrook and execute their work here. That is what he was doing. It is what Millis were doing. It is what Zepeschi and Grotel and others would come to do. And so you have this golden era of Cranbrook of the 30s and early 40s with painting and ceramics and furniture. You have sculpture. You have machine shop and industrial design. You have the arrival of Charles Eames behind the camera here, filming Eeliel and Eero Saarinen. But it wasn't all just nuns having fun. It was everyone sort of having fun. And so you see this football game happening on the campus with Ralph Rapson, the great architect, carrying the football. And then there were parties. Here's the Come As a Song party. And then all of it was sort of gave rise to this moniker, the Country Club of Art, these fabulous buildings, these tennis courts, these pools, these gardens, these studio spaces. And there were more formal events like this tea where you see George Booth and Loya Saarinen chatting. And I don't want us to get away from the fact that George Booth is always involved here. He is always at the meetings. He is head of the foundation. He is advising all of this. But he really trusts these artists that he's assembled. And so Eeliel and Loya sort of sit at the top. Here they are at the Crandemonium Ball of 1934 in outfits of Loya's own creation. But there was a lot of work going on at the same time. It was this, again, idea of work and life being one and the same. And here in the studio number 5, you can see at night how the students would just be visible through this wall of clear glass, and how different this is from the earlier studios, the brick studios with their slate roofs. Here we have a wall of glass with a copper roof, and it's reading more and more like the Bauhaus, which by this point has closed. It was closed by the Nazis in 1933, but you have this connection between the sort of aesthetic, the factory aesthetic of the Bauhaus, come to Cranbrook. And the Bauhaus was really led, just like Cranbrook, by these supreme masters of their craft, and they were called the Bauhaus masters, people like Kandinsky and Klee and Gropius and Joseph Albers. Later, Mies would become the leader of the Bauhaus. But they also had fun. Here is the Hotel Gropius with the students hanging out. But what Cranbrook was not like with the Bauhaus, we didn't have that socialist bent. The Bauhaus really thought that they would save the world. They thought they were building a better Germany, and they marketed their wares to build a better Germany, so they were going into production from the studio. They were having wallpaper lines coming out of the student studios. They were having furniture that was being mass-produced out of the studios, and Cranbrook never hit that scale. Of course, we've had great industrial and product designers come out of Cranbrook, but the ethos of the institution never had that sort of Bauhausian social aim. And it was a very different philosophy than what Frank Lloyd Wright was starting at his Taliesin Fellowship, where it was, again, this sort of school, a cult of a personality. Instead, Cranbrook's community did not require its students to build the school, which Frank Lloyd Wright did. He required his fellows to farm the land. Instead, Eliel was leading a sort of diverse expressions of thoughts. He wanted you to come in with the project you wanted to work in, to bring experience. He wanted only experienced students who needed time and needed space to work out their problems. And so he wasn't teaching, he wasn't critiquing. He would go to the studios every day and he would sit with the students and he would, instead of saying, you should do this, or why did you do that, he would say things like, well, why is that? Or is that the best way to go forward? It was always questions. And then in the evenings or at those events, they would talk about architecture, but it was learning in a very different way than traditional schools, certainly very different than the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And so why, if Eliel starts his architecture students, they come here in 1931. His son also has graduated from high school at this point. Eero Saarinen graduates from Baldwin High School. He goes to Paris, just like his mother, and studies sculpture for a year. But in 1932, he's ready to enroll in school. What would be a better spot than continuing his lessons under his father and enrolling at the new Cranbrook Academy of Art? He could have gone here. No, instead he goes to Yale. And he goes into this Gothic building that must be centuries old, this cloister turned into an architectural studio. In fact, no. This is a building built the same year as Cranbrook gets started, 1925. And Yale at the time was entirely based on the École des Beaux-Arts. It was the American Beaux-Arts. It was formal French training and formal lessons. And I want to talk about this because Eero is going to become such a force both here at Cranbrook in his father's life, and then next week when we talk about mid-century modernism. So I want to discuss Eero for a moment in his time at Yale because it's a very different education than what he had gotten working under his father's drafting board in Finland as a boy or working here at Cranbrook as a teenager. And so he's at Yale in the midst of Yale's greatest reinvention of itself. They are tearing down the 19th and 18th century building, and they are building Neo-Gothic Yale, 1931. So the same year that Eliel forms his architecture department, Yale dedicates its magnificent sort of cathedral of books, a 14-story skyscraper clad in Gothic wrapping. And one of the critiques of American eclecticism, of traditional architecture at this time, was that it wasn't true to materials. And that's especially true with the Yale example. There is nothing Gothic about that construction. Eliel had avoided those problems by saying this is true to materials. These bricks are actually doing the work. This roof is doing the work. He doesn't clad anything. It's a very expensive way of avoiding the critique, but you can't say that Eliel is producing false architecture. At Yale, that's all the architecture students could talk about, was that this is the best this building ever looked, when it was just a sort of steel skyscraper, and then it was wrapped in this false Gothicism. And so the architecture students were just horrified, and this goes on for a decade. So Yale completely reinvents itself, including Gothic skyscrapers, which almost reads like a sort of jazzy Gothic, and is yet again coming directly from Eliel Saarinen's Tribune Tower competition, and Eero is watching this out of his studio window. in the studio, they're almost as conservative as the university's building habits are. So they're doing these Beaux-Arts plans, these grand drawings that you would be locked in a room for 8 hours to produce. And you would use watercolor, you would use gouache, you would use ink. And so you see the front of this building, the plan of the building, and then little scenes of the building. And then these would be evaluated in anonymous critiques, so the students did not hear the evaluation, and you got a write-up that was just pass, does not pass, fails. And then they would often be sent to New York and evaluated again, and they would be ranked on a sort of national scale with all of the schools that were using the American Beaux-Arts system. Yen Liang was a student. He was Yale's first Chinese student. He, interestingly, would go on to be Frank Lloyd Wright's first apprentice, which I think shows you that the students don't always line up with the aesthetic. Eero comes into this Beaux-Arts world. Here is a monument to Bach. Again, very neoclassical, very traditional. But then within the confines of this Beaux-Arts system, he starts designing in much more radical ways. So here you see a monumental form where you have these sweeping sort of art moderne curves, look like a train going across. And then the clock, which is the subject of this competition, was to design a clock. And you have all the greats of art and architecture. You have Kahn, you have Millis, you have Hood. Who might be missing at the 12 o'clock hand? Perhaps his own father? It leaves room for this ambiguity. And Raymond Hood, seen here, was Eero's chief critic for his final year. And Raymond Hood, the great New York architect, is who beat Eero Saarinen in the Tribune Tower competition. And he only taught at Yale 1 year, and it was while Eero was there. But you see Eero's designs are becoming blockier. They're becoming more abstract. They're becoming more massive. There's no more ornament here. There's no moldings. It is escaping the sort of neo-Roman Beaux-Arts method. It's keeping the proportions, it's keeping the scale, the planning, it's even keeping the drawing type, but the building is becoming something different. And the students were looking to New York. They were looking to the Museum of Modern Art and its famous show, the International Modern Show, which traveled around the country, 14 different cities over 2 years. It introduced the machine aesthetic. It introduced the European modernists to the masses. And it introduced the term international modernism. That was the title of the book. And it featured architects like Walter Gropius, like Mies with his flat pavilion that's all plains, it's all roof and wall, but none of them are represented like a roof or a wall. It is total abstraction, it is modernism, it is no history. And then most famously, it introduces Le Corbusier to the American audience. And you have to think that the students must have felt Yale was so backwards. They were building these buildings, they were doing these projects. This is what they wanted to be, this is what they had. Eero, who always got second place in the competitions, he was called Second Medal Saarinen, he finally gets first place in something, and he gets a massive fellowship to go and study and do measured drawings in Europe for 2 years. And measured drawings are where you go up to the temple and you take your ruler and then you draw, literally measure, and then later in life, when you're designing a bank and you need a perfect column, you go to the temple drawings that you measured and you put them on your building. And instead of doing that, he sends back watercolors. And he's sending things back to Yale. He has to send 15 a month to keep getting his checks. And instead of the drawings, he's doing watercolors. And he writes that he was so much more interested in the form, in the shadow, in the quality of light, in the space that ancient architecture could create. And so he's capturing these very abstract ideas instead of these very sort of formal ideas. And he does get one project while he's in Europe, in Helsinki. He designs this little art gallery, a sort of Kunsthal. And you see it is nothing like what he had designed at Yale. It is nothing like what his father had designed for Cranbrook up to this point. It's glass, it's curved, it's flat-roofed. And Eero then comes back to Yale about the same time that his father is working on the Cranbrook Institute of Science, which is our sort of own little entry into the international modern style, flat-roofed, ribbon windows, limited ornament, boxy, utilitarian form, architecture as machine for the machine age. It did not start that way. It started with an observatory designed by George Booth. and then it was extended by Eero Saarinen, and then Saarinen sort of wipes out the George Booth building, and then sheathes Booth's design in the same brick so that he has this very functional appearance. And then the sort of formal logic, which has been attributed to Eero, that it's the son coming back to his father's studio that makes this flat roof. It then comes to a sort of ornamental entry point where you have limestone columns that are load-bearing with this very subtle design repeated on each column, supporting this cast concrete roof. But the back of the building is where it really becomes quite exciting to those students who love German modernism, because it looks like this very functional machine of a building. And the work of Saarinen the senior begins to show the influence of Saarinen Jr. They are in partnership together, so it's father, son, and son-in-law and daughter, all working together, but they don't all work on every project. This is a sketch by Eero for a little house in Fenton, Michigan, a community house, which once it's built is this sort of taut little box, and we see sort of Eero's influence with the flat roofs, with these sort of linear planes, and then we see the father's influence with the stone, with the chimney, these sort of classical signs of building. And I'm not equating these two projects, but the Museum of Modern Art is the sort of most famous box happening in America at the time. So in 1939, they move into their home on East 54th Street in Manhattan, the first modern building for a modern museum. But what's interesting about that 1939 date for MoMA's home is that it's the same year that Eero, and Bob Swanson win the competition to design a new Smithsonian Gallery of Art. And so the same year that MoMA opens, Washington, D.C. selects this radical design from the Saarinen partnership. And so here are the three partners in the office taken in press publicity photos. And the design was really praised by this group of people, sort of architectural intelligentsia. So we have Gropius there, we have Hudnut, who's the dean of Harvard. It's all the sort of architectural who's who saying, this is wonderful, this is the future of architecture. But they are trying to build this in a city and next to this. So this is going up at the exact same time that this competition happens. And they were actually meant to face off with each other. So that's the top of Air and Space, designed by Cranbrook alum Goya Obata. This is where the Saarinen Museum would have been. So it would have been facing off this Beaux-Arts Roman temple by the American classicist John Russell Pope, one of the finest architects I know, but it's this very different arrangement of blocks of forms anchored by a tower on the theater and then filled with these galleries with sort of rolling walls, very unusual shape of galleries, not linear, not little boxes, not skylit, but instead this experiential sequence that's heavily indebted to Eames and what Eames was doing at Cranbrook at the exact same moment. And then on the other end of the building was to be this grand theater, all of it facing the mall with this pool of water, which is one of Saarinen's great signatures to his projects. And you see there is a Millis sculpture. And then you would head into this brick and glass building into the theater. And the Saarinen firm really becomes known for their theater work at this time. The major one that is built is Kleinhans Music Hall, which is a WPA project. And Kleinhans, the way that these models are built and photographed is very different from those models that we saw at the beginning, where it looks almost realistic, where you have the clay model and the buildings seem very massive and the nature seems very real. Here, the model looks like a machine. You are building a machine for listening to music, so the model should reflect that abstraction. And it's influenced by Le Corbusier and his Palace of the Soviets, where you have the smaller council here and the larger Soviet meeting room here. Kleinhaus is the same arrangement. You have the concert hall for 3,000 here, and you have the smaller hall for 800 here. And it's shaped, in Eliel's terminology, like the violin case for the instrument inside. So he has designed the case, and then the performer is the instrument inside. And the form comes from that direct function, meeting that sort of modernist argument that form should follow function, taken to this sort of logical extreme. And you enter the building around these pools of water, which are reflecting what at this point is called Cranbrook brick, because of Saarinen's renown of building Cranbrook in Cranbrook brick, and Mankato limestone, the same stone as Kingswood. And you enter the concert facility through into this lobby between the two spaces. And here we see the influence of Eames, who was associated with this project, designed the furniture. And we begin to see curves for the first time into Saarinen's work. And these are coming from places like Norman Bell Geddes, which Eero briefly worked in New York on this project for the World's Fair for General Motors, where you have thousands of people snaking up to go and see the world of tomorrow. And then Eero comes back and designs things like this dressing room. And then the concert hall itself, which is, I think, more sort of classic Art Deco, very much showing the influence of buildings like Radio City Music Hall. Other projects by the firm at this time include the Crow Island School, which is a landmark of lower school education. And in the early designs, you see arrows using the same hipped roof of Kingswood. But in the finished project, both because of budget and for taste, the hipped roof is gone and you have a flat roof. And then you have these sort of classroom units that are each giving light and air to every student. And Eero, at this point, enters and begins designing buildings on his own for the first time. So in 1938, without his father, he enters into a competition to design a theater at William and Mary. And it's really American universities that are at the forefront of modernism. This is the year before the Smithsonian project. And so Eero, with his students at Cranbrook, Eero was not a student, but students Ralph Rapson and Fred James, designs for colonial William and Mary this radical idea of a theater being these sort of strips and blocks. And he wins the competition. It should be built, except for the outcry against it. And we have to look at the same date. So it would have been coming right on the heels of the reconstruction of the governor's palace. And so you have sort of two options of American architecture. You can have modern or you can have tradition. You can have the past, you can have the future. But these are both extremes. And so is there a way that you can have both? Is there a way you can combine them? And I think that's where enter in the art museum here at Cranbrook. And Eero Saarinen never said he had a favorite building. He always said, like so many architects, my favorite building is my next. But I think this was sort of his magnum opus of his long career. So here's his drawing of the building about 1940. Here again is where we left off. This is about 1936, and I wanted to point out here, what do you see in Millis's yard? But 8 little statues, which becomes the Orpheus Fountain. And here you have the Orpheus Fountain before the museum is built. So the fountains and landscaping were all done before the construction on the museum got started. George Booth had money, but he didn't have quite enough to pull it off all at once, and so he built his terraces and pools first, and then the museum construction is slipped in between. And like all Cranbrook buildings, it's traditional masonry, so the stone of those columns is supporting the concrete and steel weight of the roof. The stone of the walls is what is supporting the building. There's no steel frame here. And what perplexes me about this building, and I feel like I'm closer than ever, but ask me again in 2 weeks and I'll have a different theory of where is this coming from? Where does this open framework, this unusual form, what precedent is Saarinen looking at? I think it's what makes his architecture so wonderful is this inability to pin it down. But there are a few places that he's looking. He's looking at the world of museums and at the contemporary architecture around him. So we can look at buildings like the very first art gallery by Sohn, the Dulwich Picture Gallery, which launches 1,000 museums, a large center opening surrounded by rings of galleries lit by skylights on the roof. And that, again, I could have chosen any number of museum. I used the Brooklyn Museum to show this Beaux-Arts type, the center entrance, rings of gallery lit by windows or skylights at the top. But more than these, though it does have that center and wings, there is no center. You can walk straight through it. So it's not this. It's not coming from that. I think he was also looking at Schinkel, the great German proto-modernist, and Schinkel's Altes Museum, which is this sort of Greek temple stretched to the nth degree, as the Greeks would never have done it, turned into this sort of taut facade. And there's glass in this image, but there wasn't when it opened. And so the middle of that huge row of columns would have been open. So this is outside, and you would come this long row from the palace and then up into the museum in this open space in a manner quite similar to what Eero does here. And then the Altes Museum has the Roman Parthenon in the center, which we'll ignore, but it again establishes this idea of the stairs, an open center, and then galleries all around, which becomes quite an enduring model. The DIA, the Great Beaux-Arts Museum, is the same plan, center with galleries around it. I think it comes to a head with the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which is a museum based on that South Kensington model, where you're teaching, it's a teaching collection, and if you're teaching people about good design and about architecture, you need to have it as close to the original as possible. And so completely archaeologically correct down to the polychrome, which Kimball believed the Roman and Greek temples had. And so it is this real sort of tour de force of archaeological correctness. This is an architect who used measured drawings. Saarinen is very different. Within that same formal logic, there is no traditional ornament. There is no pediment. There is no sort of, what is he teaching here? He's teaching materials and weight and form, shape, but he's not saying reproduce this. He's not saying this is the end-all, be-all. It's a different thought. And so again, I come back to, where is he getting this? What is he looking at? Is he looking at ancient Rome and an open colonnade? I mean, he's not looking at it. This is a street, and it's pretty much the same idea, this open colonnade. But there's also this sort of Scandinavian classicism. This was an unbuilt proposal that Saarinen probably would have seen because it was fairly widely published, and you see this, again, idea of attenuated square columns. Even more influential, and in a book I know Saarinen had, is Hoffmann's plan for the Austrian pavilion, which I think is interesting because here we see the arrangement with the top center raised up and then two lower wings that actually hold the function. So functionless ceremonial center and then two buildings on the side. And the architects, they always look at things. So no architect designs straight from nothing. So I'm not in any way saying Eliel's copying this. I'm just trying to figure out what was in his mind when he was designing. And he certainly would have known the work of his friend, the Swedish architect Gunnar Asplund, who lectures here in the year that the museum begins construction and this is completed. And this is the Woodland Crematorium, which has a sculpture in the center by one of Millis's peers from France, from Rodin's studio. And then there's this unique American style of stripped classicism. We finally got into it. And the great form giver of American stripped classicism was Paul Philippe Cret. Remember, Cret was trained at the Beaux-Arts in France. He immigrates to America to lead the University of Pennsylvania's architecture program. And in this age of building great neoclassical temples, he builds the Folger Shakespeare Library. And this is one of the early buildings to get rid of things like column capitals, to get rid of things like entablatures and moldings, and he replaces them with this abstraction. There's no sculpture grouping here. Instead, it's the window and the surface of the wall. It's almost like he shaved the classical ornament off. And his greatest building is the Federal Reserve, where again you have the proportions of classicism stripped of its detail. And in Detroit, we do have some great stripped classical buildings. I think the best is the Rackham Educational Building next to the DIA, with sculptures by Cranbrook's own Marshall Fredericks. And Cret, of course, is the architect who did the DIA. So you see the evolution in one man's career from the sort of more archaeologically correct temple front to this stripped design. And then we compare this to Cranbrook, and George Booth is looking at the DIA. He is facing criticism. We have the Detroit Museum. Your brother was the president of it who built this building. Why are you building this suburban museum? And Booth has all sorts of arguments, correct ones, about how his is different and how they complement, don't compete. But at the same time, in 1940, he looks at Rodin's The Thinker, and he says, you know, I also need a thinker here in the suburbs. And so we have Marshall Frederick's philosopher chimpanzee here. As Booth said, it wasn't exactly what I asked for, but I'm quite certain that chimp is thinking much more interesting thoughts than the rest of us. Now, around the time that Saarinen is getting ready to design the art museum, he and Mrs. Saarinen visit the Paris World's Fair of 1937. You'll remember that the Art Deco show of 25 launches his sort of interest in the Art Deco and launches that great style. The Paris World's Fair of 37, I think, has less of a positive legacy and more of a short run-up. Its greatest monument is this semicircular replacement of Baroque palaces with this great arc of a series of different museums. So this is for the World's Fair. These are permanent buildings. We're looking from the Eiffel Tower straight down. And in the permanent buildings were permanent sculptures. But you'll notice that the ornament of it is this stripped classical style. And they're looking at Cray, they're looking at this American movement, and they're bringing it to Europe. Other places of the same World's Fair, you have the Museum of Modern Art, which has this sort of colonnade, the peristyle-esque connection between the two. And Saarinen was here. He saw this. He saw it without the Japanese garden. And then more ominously at this World's Fair, what is opposite the palace were the pavilions for the Nazis by Albert Speer and the pavilion for the Soviets by Boris Eiffel. And so the Nazis really begin to rely on this stripped classical style. It's part of their whole sort of aesthetic movement. And because the Nazis use it, it becomes impossible to use after the war. And the fascists are, I think, who do it better. And so we start with sort of Mussolini's architectural movement to create this third Rome, and so he builds the Mussolini Forum. You have this series of museums, all of it culminating at the what's now the headquarters of Fendi. This sort of new Rome, this new Colosseum, stripped of all ornament. And it's this idea of nation building, it's this idea of oppression, of demonstrating the imperial aims of a people. It's very different than Saarinen's own sort of nationalist museum, the Finnish National Museum, which of course was agitating for independence from Russia, but with this real celebration of the forest. His national museum starts at the scale of the myth of the country, and then comes out of the moss and the frogs and the woods into this sort of stone and granite. Mussolini's is sort of coming from much darker, much more sort of ominous places. And so Saarinen's building gets unfortunately wrapped up into this because it's the same time period. But I hope I've shown that Saarinen's is coming from all these different strains. And I don't think that the museum is fascist. And I think my final argument on it is that Mussolini is attempting to oppress his subjects, to use architecture to control his people. And Saarinen is attempting to uplift us. He is bringing us over water, surrounded by sculpture, surrounded by these sort of things that make you think and make you feel delight. And then you raise up onto the hill and you enter into places of learning that are open to all. It is a very different sort of celebration of humanity. But just as a sort of counterexample of why stripped classicism ends after the war, you cannot possibly build in this mode again. And so American architecture after the war becomes very light and airy and sort of open, and it represents this sort of openness of a new world. In my closing slides here, I want to just do a walkthrough of the museum, sort of starting from the different ways that we can approach it. And so in this lecture, we talked about the creation of the very first buildings. We talked about the Arts and Crafts Courtyard and its art club, Saarinen's house, Millis's house, the studios for the students and faculty and dormitories. And then the last building, 1942, the museum is built out across. And it completes this vision begun about 1925. It is Saarinen's last great work, and it's George Booth's last great work at Cranbrook. And you can approach it as you do the public through the Nichols Gate with Saarinen's wonderful sort of eighth of a circle popping up, welcoming you in, but then you immediately come to this body of water that you can't walk through. So you're forced to the side. Saarinen knew that if he let you walk straight to the museum, it would destroy the magic of these moments where the museum has a look. And so he pushes you to the side and then reveals a new look closer to the museum. It keeps you from destroying either vista. And of course, Millis's sculpture groupings, which were all bought about 1934 by the Cranbrook Foundation, 64 works by Millis as part of keeping him here. So these are sculptures that Millis created for other places. George Booth buys editions of, and Saarinen builds his architecture around. And the bull in Europa, where Europa, a beautiful Phoenician princess, has been sort of seduced by Zeus in the form of a bull, and they're about to ride across the Aegean Sea to Knossos, this wonderful sort of mysterious, weird sort of thing to put at the center. But you see this expansion, this sort of limitless horizon. Is it Versailles? Is it University of Virginia? It could be anything. There's all these sort of illusions. And of course, before the bull in Europa could get there, they have to go to Knoxville, which is another place where Bull in Europa sit, at the University of Tennessee. And then the museum itself is this great sweep, this great brick wall with nothing on it, windows below, and then the colonnade at the center. The next approach is my preferred, and what those of you who got here early enough used, the ramp of the Chinese dog, which is neither a ramp and it's a lion. But he brings you up and he frames the view. And so he's all about controlling how you see this building. It's very different from the earlier work, the boys' school, where you want to explore it. The art museum is telling you, look here, stand here, go here. And then on this side, you see how it connects to the studios. And it's essentially the campus is all one building on this side of the street. They're all connected buildings. And looking down, notice it's grass, not brick between, which one of you in the audience had your grandfather send you out with scissors to cut these grass pavers. And then the great window of the library, which is actually stone construction. And so Saarinen is giving himself limits that are unnecessary. He's giving himself the same limits of a Gothic architecture. The window can only be so wide because it is a stone window. He could have used steel, he could have done something different, but he's still interested in that honesty, that expression of the material. And so you have this very Gothic sort of library and the first of many curious sort of runes decorating the building, ornamenting the building. And then the other alternative is to enter through the steps around the great Orpheus fountain, the primal shapes of a circle in a square, and then the group of figures which were commissioned by the Stockholm Concert Hall, and you see them here, much worse building, but also much worse sighting, and they're very close together. There's no water, and Orpheus is actually there. Saarinen won't let Millis put Orpheus in because he knows that this 32-foot Orpheus will destroy his 38-foot columns. But he also spreads them out, and so in this more suburban locale, they become to sort of come into their own. And here we have Beethoven, who is in agony that he can no longer hear. He's lost his sense of sound, and so all the other figures are being awoken by Orpheus, and Beethoven can no longer hear. Of course, Orpheus isn't here, so no one can hear him. But then there's all these other Millis sculptures. So here's the Folk Freiberg, who's this figure, this grandfather out searching for his abducted grandchild. And he's situated on this pedestal that Saarinen designs. And Millis loved to put his works on pedestals because he liked to see the pedestal against the sky. He wanted the human to be below and look up at his sculptures. And so that's why he had all those Roman columns at his Millisgarten. But Saarinen puts it as Millis prefers, but then he backs it up against the building. So you always see it frontally or from the side. And I find this to be the strangest base. This is Saarinen, not Millis. It has the form of an anvil. And so again, iron coming in here at our last moment. And then notice how the library window is brick to the edge, but then the art museum window is stone surround. So all these sort of riches that break up the symmetry, break up the formalism, and sort of give these questions. What are these? I don't know. They're ornament. It's this sort of, the building has been so abstracted, so stripped of classical ornament, that instead you're given these moments where the sort of pressure of the structure, the pressure of the purpose of the building, art, education, is pushing out, and you have these sort of things that just appear on the stonework. And they appear everywhere, and they're all mysterious and wonderful. Here's another Millis sculpture, and we look at how he joins the building to the earth, and so it's all sharp, it's rectilinear, but then it's soft when you get close. And as the building ages, the Mankato Kasota limestone naturally degrades, and so the building has this very wonderful tactile richness to this modernism, to these flat roofs. And we look up, and there's no column capital, but instead the stone is actually coming out, which is literally revealing how these stone columns, not steel columns, stone columns are supporting the concrete roof. And so he's given us that visual answer. So instead of reading like little toothpicks that might just blow over, the column reaches up and supports this pressed concrete ceiling. And then right where the building meets the sky, where the building says hello to the heavens, we have this classical molding, the one classical detail. I think it's fabulous that in aluminum, the great modern material, he almost wittily says, well, I do know my classical orders. I've just chosen to not put them here. And then what's wonderful if you spend enough time here is the way that light sort of cuts the building. It's like slicing butter, these shadows that get thrown around this peristyle. And that to me is almost enough purpose to give here in not climately warm Michigan a room that is, usable for a very limited amount of time, is this great interior exterior. Are you in or are you out? And if you're here in the daytime, you have to wonder, what is this? Is it a figure? Is it a body? Is it me projecting into the space? I don't know. But then you're here at night and you see that it's a light. And so it shines up onto the ceiling. So there's 3 lights here that shine down and give us usable light. But if it was just those, you would have a very dark look. You would have a light on the ground and a dark above. And so Saarinen designs this lamp to shoot light up and reflect it back down. And there's this sort of sinuous curve around the top of the light fixture, which I think is almost an homage to his fellow Finn, and at this point, friend, generation younger, Alvar and Aino Aalto with their famous Savoy vases, where they take the sort of lakes of Finland and put them into glass. Saarinen here, the only curve on the building. And then this little stone circle, which, what is it? I don't know, but it's fully part of the stonework. So you'll see in the drawings in the archives, 2.5-inch monolithic stone ball, not doweled. Even to the last detail, Saarinen is saying, do not be false with this. Do not stick this onto the side. It is part of the block. And then we move to the doors, which are 3,000 pounds of bronze between the 2 doors. And you see on the museum side, you have these sort of botanic forms growing side to side. You have the Egyptian head in the niche on the outside. The library, the doors grow up and down, and you have St. Paul being struck, given the sort of act of God, the word of Jesus, and he's inside of the niche. And then we follow him, and he is being converted. He's being struck down on this little wedge, and then we can head into the library and we can be converted with the knowledge that is inside of this very sort of stripped down functionalist room. And on the opposite side, on the museum, as you originally entered it, Saarinen's designs for the cabinetry, his welcome desk. We see a rug woven by Loya Saarinen, and we see this German window from 1924. And you can look through the window out into the landscaping, seeing the Old Testament, and it's something Saarinen is always interested in. How do you look from the building outside? And so thinking back to his own house, where there's only these leaded glass windows on the 2nd floor, but they project through onto the shears, onto the curtains. Here at the museum, he's doing the same thing. And then the museum collection at this moment is encyclopedic. Encyclopedic to George Booth's own taste, but here we're looking at Asian art and ancient art, and then you head towards the center, and you have these that are not skylights. This is the first museum built in America without skylights. These are, in fact, fluorescent lights, and so Saarinen is not sort of ignorant of technological trends, and so he's using fluorescent lights in these little domes, which is a break from all sort of museum history and becomes one of the great sort of influences of the museum as it's visited by countless number of museum curators. And this museum is quite popular, it's quite influential. It sort of sets the standard for a whole slew of post-war museums. And I think as sort of Saarinen is completing this project, George Booth is completing his vision of Cranbrook, and he sort of looks at the materials, these stones, these bricks, and he's building in relation to what came before, to all of history, and he's building for the generation to come. And in that there is this sort of transcendence of human mortality, and he's built something for the ages. Thank you.